Okay, I guess we'll get started a little late here, but that's fine. We've got two great sessions this afternoon and more tomorrow morning, so I encourage you to come here starting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's my pleasure to turn the session over to Dr. Pippa Holloway, who's in the history department at Middle Tennessee State University, and she's going to moderate this session with Cherisse JonesBranch.
Thanks, Bill. And thanks to all of you. Welcome to the afternoon session of this wonderful Richard Milbauer Symposium on Southern History. We've been through, had some wonderful talks and some great discussions yesterday afternoon and so far today. And I'm sure we're in for much more of that in this afternoon session. One of the things that I've really been struck by is that as we're discussing historical events, we're also discussing how we do history. And then also in the process, realizing that in many ways, how we do history is also making history itself. So there's a lot of layers of reflection and opportunities to think about why we do and why what we do is important. I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Link for inviting all of us here for this wonderful event, and also to David Meltzner for his wonderful assistance with all of our travel arrangements and all of the logistics. And finally, I want to thank all the other participants in these events. All of you who've been in the audience and on the panel on these speaking events have really contributed to the richness of all this, and I'm grateful for all of your shared wisdom and thoughts. So this afternoon's presentation is by Cherisse JonesBranch, who will be giving her talk titled, "Can the Sistas Get Some History Too? Transformation in Southern Black Women's History." Cherisse JonesBranch is the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Endowed Professor of History at Arkansas State University. She received her PhD from Ohio State University, where we had the pleasure of sharing a dissertation advisor in Susan Hartman, also a pioneer of women's history. And we were at Ohio State together for a brief period of time at the same time. She also has a bachelor's and master's degree from the College of Charleston in South Carolina. Professor JonesBranch is the author of several important books, including Crossing the Line, Women's Interracial Activism in South Carolina During and After World War II, which was published by the University Press of Florida in 2014. She is the co-editor of many books, or several books, including most recently, Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times, which came out this year with the University of Georgia Press, and it's a wonderful contribution to this series on women in southern states. She has a book in progress, which is titled Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Rural Black Women's Activism in Arkansas, 1913 to 1965. And she is involved in many, many other projects. In fact, I could probably spend the rest of the afternoon reciting to you her 25-page CV, but I will not do that. But you can look it up online if you need to. Among other things, she is the co-founder of the A-State Digital Initiative Consortium, the director of the A-State Digital Press, and has her hand in many, many other exciting projects in the historical field. So, welcome.
Thank you for that, Pippa. Good afternoon. Let me just start by saying how very happy and honored I am to be with everyone today. I'm basically going to say everything everyone else has already said. Thank you so much, Catherine Clinton, for inviting me to be a part of this symposium. I'm also very humbled to be included among scholars whose work I deeply respect, and this work has also significantly informed my own. Thank you, Bill Link, for making all of this possible, and David Meltzner, a special high five to you for taking care of all of the logistics. So let's get down to business, shall we? This is a picture of Annie Zachary Pike, and I'm going to say more about her in a little while. So let's stick a pin in that. I will come back to it. But first, I am a Southern Black woman. I was raised in Charleston, South Carolina. I am the descendant of the Gullah. Both the maternal and paternal sides of my family have been in the South Carolina Low Country at least since the 18th century. I can trace my lineage to Brook Green Gardens in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, which is located in Georgetown County. and I'm just scrolling through this, where I was once told some of my relatives lived until as late as the 1960s. I am the direct descendant of the black women who bore, nursed, raised, and buried all who resided there. We, are Southern black women whose lives and stories have not been told in ways that fully acknowledge them as the guiding force in African Americans' ongoing struggle for freedom and liberty. The scholarship on Southern women's history has increased over the past 50 years, to be sure, but as yet the remaining silences surrounding black women's existence across time and space still beg the question, can the sisters get some history too? And that is the question upon which I will speak today. And this is Brook Green Gardens today, isn't it nice? I'm sure it didn't look like that when my relatives were laboring there. I became particularly interested in late 19th century and early 20th century Southern black women's history while I was a student at the College of Charleston. Actually, let me back that up just a little bit. My first realization of the importance of Southern black women's history came when I was a debutante in 1989. You are the only people who have seen this picture in the last 30 years, okay? For well over 50 years by that point, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, or AKA, easily the most elite black women's sorority in Charleston, had sponsored an annual debutante ball. It was a heinous and bourgeois experience, but my mother made me do it. I spent just about every Saturday of my senior year of high school with older members of this organization at their sorority house in downtown Charleston, learning how to become a cultured, well-spoken young woman. As irritated as I was by this debacle, and by the way, although I am an AKA legacy, I pledge a completely different organization. As an 18-year-old, I was nonetheless struck by the organization's history and that of black women who made up its membership. Fast forward to a couple of years later, I had returned from the Persian Gulf. Yes, I am a war veteran. And transferred from South Carolina State University in Orangeburg to the College of Charleston. I am sure that my advisor at the time, Dr. Amy McCandless, must have mentioned the Southern Association for Women Historians to me, but I was too busy battling post-traumatic stress syndrome to appreciate her words. I really learned about the SAWH as a graduate student at the College of Charleston. My first encounter with the SAWH was in the 90s at the College of Charleston. It was where I first met Catherine Clinton. I don't know if you remember that. Where are you? It was on Bull Street, remember, on that porch? And she urged me, I had just completed a master's thesis on Charleston's black club women, and she urged me to interview some of the women I discussed, which I subsequently did. In the process of doing so, I learned that cultivating and utilizing community connections was key to unearthing Southern black women's stories because they most often cannot be found in traditional archives. I did not really appreciate the skill necessary to effectively mine marginalized resources then, but I certainly have since then. It has continued to deeply inform my foray into Southern women's history. To be clear, the ways in which Southern women's history has developed over the past half-century has been nothing short of exciting. But in my estimate, the most significant and exciting change within the field has been the ever-increasing production of scholarship on Southern black women's history. From the time that I first read Deborah Gray White's Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South, Tara Hunter's To Joy My Freedom, Southern Black Women's Lives and Labors After the Civil War, Stephanie Shaw's What a Woman Ought to Be and to Do, Black Professional Workers During the Jim Crow Era, and by the way, she was also on my dissertation committee, Paula Giddings' When and Where I Enter, The Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America, and Darlene Clark Hines' Hindsight, Black Women in the Reconstruction of American History, and of course the many works by Thavolia Glimpf in graduate school. I was intrigued by the unearthing and the excavation of black women's voices from the caverns of American, African American, Southern, and women's history. This scholarship opened a new yet entirely familiar world of historical inquiry with black women squarely positioned at its center. Other works like Dana Ramey Berry's Swing the Sickle for the Harvest is Ripe, Gender and Slavery in Antebellum Georgia, and Mary Farmer Kaiser's Freed Women and the Freedmen's Bureau, Race, Gender, and Public Policy in the Age of Emancipation continue to elucidate Black women's historical struggles against both racism and sexism. They further illuminate their civil, political, and educational activism in ways that demonstrate that despite their historical marginalization, they exercised the agency and autonomy and resistance that demonstrated that they were community leaders rather than just mere followers. And rather, this expert also expertly probes the contours and nuances of the world from Black women's perspectives, and again asks the question, can the sisters get some history too? This astutely crafted public sentiment and expression of Black women's collective will also allowed them to wield considerable social, economic, and political power in their communities. One of the things that I have been most proud to do is participate in a program in New York City with what is known as the History Makers. And at this program, about a year ago, this is a picture of me with Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham in her book, Righteous Discontent. And after I gave my presentation on Black women, she came up to me, told me she loved it, and she wanted my card, and I nearly passed out. And so that's a picture of her, me and her doing that. While not exclusively focused on the South, Betty Collier Thomas's groundbreaking and exhaustively researched 2010 book, Jesus, Jobs, and Justice, African American Women and Religion, builds on Higginbotham's work in Righteous Discontent by chronicling a diverse array of Black women as activists in churches through such organizations as the African American Episcopal Zion Churches, Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Society, but also across racial lines through such female-centered and led organizations as the Young Women's Christian Association and Church Women United. Thomas also examines Black church women's experiences as founders of such organizations as the National Association of Colored Women and the National Council of Negro Women, and as often marginalized leaders in male-dominated organizations like the NAACP, of which at least two Black women, Mississippi's Ida B. Wells Barnett and Memphis, Tennessee's Mary Church Terrell, remain largely unheralded as its co-founders. And speaking of Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell, studies abound about the former, but less so about the latter. Paula J. Giddings, Maya Bay, Patricia Schechter, Sarah Silke, among others, have published multiple works that have fleshed out the contours of Wells Barnett's life and activism. That is less so the case with Terrell, with the exception of Joan Quigley's 2006 book, Just Another Southern Town, Mary Church Terrell, and the Struggle for Racial Justice in the Nation's Capital, and my own chapter, Mary Church Terrell, Revisiting the Politics of Race, Class, and Gender, and Sarah Wilkerson Freeman and Beverly Bond's 2011 edited collection, Tennessee Women, Their Lives and Times. Scholars have further recognized both Wells Barnett and Terrell as national leaders. I also add to this list educator and activist Mary McLeod Bethune as an exemplar of this leadership within and beyond Southern Black communities. As a Black woman leader, she skillfully, and at times, according to Bethune biographer Joyce A. Hanson, contradictory, reached across the racial morass of Southern apartheid to obtain critical support for her initiatives. Whatever her methods, she employed this strategy to found the Daytona Educational Industrial Institute Training School for Negro Girls right here in Florida, and the National Council of Negro Women in 1904 and 1935, respectively. Both were specifically established to develop Black women leaders who were then expected to become uplift advocates in African American communities nationwide. This body of work, among others, has profoundly sharpened understandings of the intellectual labor in which Black women engage as they carefully assessed and navigated the temporal and geographic times in which they travailed. In doing so, they empowered themselves and their communities through their individual, collective, community, and institutional activism. They challenged scholars of Southern Black women's history to explore the silences that often reveal much about the complexities of their lives in deeply and often hostile racialized contexts. Now I will turn to some of the burgeoning trends that I see in Southern Black women's history. Much of the aforementioned scholarship centers on Black women with Southern roots who either left the South entirely or moved back and forth between the South and urban areas. I am keenly interested in Black women who live most of their lives in Southern locales where they recognize the issues emanating from racial apartheid and African American insubordination, but also the viability and vitality of spaces where histories of local subaltern resistance and activism had long been evident. My personal critique is that some of this recent scholarship has focused almost exclusively on Black women's lives and labors in Mississippi. This includes the publication of Chanakai Lee's 2000 study for Freedom's Sake, the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, Francois Hamlin's Crossroads at Clarksdale, the Black freedom struggle in the Mississippi Delta after World War II, Crystal Sanders' A Chance for Change, Head Start, and Mississippi's Black freedom struggle, and T.I. Morris's Woman Power Unlimited and the Black freedom struggle in Mississippi. Now, please don't misunderstand me. These are important works that either center or prominently feature Black women in their analyses, but their experiences in Mississippi do not speak for the entire South. The South is not ubiquitous, and neither are Southern Black women's stories. The extant scholarship has so far not pushed the analytical envelope on rural Black women's experiences, but the sands are shifting. Melissa Walker's All We Knew Was to Farm, Rural Women in the Upcountry South, 1919 to 1941, and Luann Jones's Mama Learned Us to Work, Farm Women in the New South, both of which include discussions on rural Black women, provided critical intellectual grounding for my own interests and inquiries in this area. How do we understand rural Southern Black women inside and outside of oppressive contexts as conscious actors and determiners of their own fate? How do we give volume to those voices and stories that have been erased from the Southern historical landscape? As I read Melissa and Luann's books, I thought deeply about how to heighten an awareness of rural Black women's lives when there were few available records. So now, just for your information, I'm going to talk about my own scholarship for a few minutes, because I think women historians are often reticent about promoting themselves in this heteropatriarchal profession. Is that okay? All right. My first book, Crossing the Line, Women's Interracial Activism in South Carolina During and After World War II, was reflective of these questions and significantly informed again how I research and tell Southern Black women's history. By looking at women such as Sarah Z. Daniels, a South Carolina Agricultural Extension Service home demonstration agent who lost her job because of her civil rights activism, I learned that agricultural records were ripe with stories about rural Black women's lives as health, educational, and political activists. In my recent turn to Arkansas history, I discovered interesting and diverse women about whom woefully little had been written, which resulted in my co-edited volume, Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times. My primary interest, however, and the subject of my next book, is Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas. And what I talk about in that book are the very many Black women who were rural activists as home demonstration agents, as Jeans industrial supervising teachers, and as members of the Arkansas Association of Colored Women. Southern Black women's connections to national events is important as well. Living and working in Arkansas has afforded me access to a plethora of untapped resources and opportunities to chronicle the unexpected forays onto the national stage. Take, for instance, Thelma Burke. And I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to this. Take, for instance, Thelma Burke, a funeral home owner in Forest City, Arkansas, located in the Delta and named after Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who in 1951 was placed on the House Un-American Activities Committee watch list because she, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, and others, signed the 1950 Stockholm Appeal calling for a ban on nuclear weapons. I have further had the distinct honor of meeting and befriending, flip the page here, meeting and befriending at least one of the Black women that I write about, Mrs. Annie R. Zachary Pike, whom I actually talked about in my address at the Southern SAWH back in 2014, who was a farmer and significant landowner in Marble, Arkansas. And by the way, she is quite alive and quite well at 87 years old. Thank you very much. In the 1960s, she served on the United States Department of Agriculture's Citizens Advisory Committee on Civil Rights, and in 1972, she ran for the Arkansas State Senate as a Republican. This was after her stint as the Phillips County Republican Party coordinator, which helped elect New Yorker Winthrop Rockefeller as Arkansas's first Republican governor since Reconstruction. So we must think strategically about how we access the resources to tell Southern Black women's histories, because much of it traditionally has not been available in privileged and mainstream, read white, archives and repositories. Let me use Annie Zachary Pike again as an example. When I began my research on her life and activism, the only thing I found about her in the archives was her name on a list in the Arkansas Republican Party files and a flyer, this flyer, from her 1972 campaign. When I discovered she was still alive, I of course immediately called her. The first few times she hung up on me. And why wouldn't she? She didn't know me from Adam's house cat, and she had absolutely no reason to trust me. And if you were not aware of this, older Black women are often very suspicious of those who contact them wanting to, quote, tell their stories for them, end quote. I knew I could not just show up on her at her house because number one, it's rude. And number two, Miss Annie, as everyone calls her, remembers well how dangerous the rural South was and still is for African Americans. What I rightly assumed and later found to be very true was that Annie Zachary Pike's home was highly weaponized, because rural Black people have always believed in armed self-defense as a means of survival. She's got a house full of shotguns. An intermediary eventually connected us after I had been vetted and found to be a member, like Miss Annie, of the Order of Eastern Star Prince Hall affiliate and the Arkansas Association of Colored Women. You see, community connections matter. I interviewed Miss Annie after she fed me a ginormous meal, which gave me the itis. If you don't know what that is, look it up in the Urban Dictionary. Scanned documents that are only available in her home, and was essentially adopted as a member of the family. So now today, whenever they have any kind of family event, I know I must go to Marble, Arkansas, excuse me. Last time I went, as a matter of fact, they sent me back with a big old bag of purple whole peas. That's the kind of stuff they do. Now that's enough about my scholarship. Because as I tell my students sometimes, I'm not about to show you all of my cards and tell you all of my tricks. And as the singer Erykah Badu once said, now keep in mind that I'm an artist, or in my case, a historian, and I'm sensitive about my shit. But what is patently demonstrable is that the field is in dire need of scholarship about Black women who live their entire lives in the 20th century rural South, and their intentionality in navigating it across the races, classes, and gender spectrum to implement impactful ways, change in ways that still to this day have largely gone unrecognized. Southern women's history is rampant with scholarly opportunities, and I would like to provide some additional thoughts about the directions in which this area of study could and indeed should go. I have read and thought long and hard about scholarship produced by Brittany Cooper, particularly her 2017 publication, Beyond Respectability, The Intellectual Thought of Race Women, and how I, can better mesh intellectual and Southern Black women's history. She considers the intellectual development of such fairly well-known Southern-born Black women as Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, and Polly Murray, among others, with much alacrity and acuity. But what might such an analysis look like if we considered the intellectual history from the perspective of Southern Black women agriculturalists, for instance, for whom it was impractical to employ respectability politics, let alone reach beyond them? How indeed did Southern Black women, particularly those who resisted the migratory tide to urban locales, make sense of a world where racism, sexism, and violence were omnipresent? How did women who by and large lacked formal education craft a language to articulate their frustrations, hopes, and dreams? How do we distill their language in ways that help us understand that, quote, dialect does not equal intellect, and that in the case of agrarian women, rurality does not equal ignorance? And I'd like to send a special shout out to my colleague, Dr. Jenny Barker Devine, for that one. How can we as scholars better excavate, read, and thoroughly interpret their long-standing invisibility in the historical record? Many of these inquiries will, for me at least, be partially informed by Keisha Blaine's, Christopher Cameron, and Ashley Farmer's new book, edited collection, New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition. The other questions I pose are as follows. Who besides Blaine Roberts in pageants, parlors, pretty women, race and beauty in the 20th century South has written about Southern Black beauty pageants as racial agrarian activism? I know, for example, that in Arkansas, Daisy Bates, whom most people know from the 1957 Little Rock Central High School crisis, was also a sponsor and a chaperone for the Spirit of Cotton contest, which existed from 1948 until 1956 as the analog of the Maid of Cotton contest. The former simultaneously celebrated Black women's beauty and African Americans' roles in cotton production. And what about Southern Black women internationalists? Studies by Greg Andrews, Dale Gore, Carol Boyce Davies, and Keisha Blaine's very recent 2018 Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom, which focuses on the Louisiana-born but Arkansas-raised Mittie Maud Lena Gordon, have elucidated Black women's internationalism in their struggle against white supremacy. We must continue to mine non-traditional resources for Southern Black women's voices so that we may continue, as Blaine said, highlighting the creative and critical ways women articulated Black internationalism during the 20th century. We should be intentional about ascertaining how these women connected global analyses of oppression to their own lived experiences. To conclude, I want to say that we must boldly, aggressively, and creatively question how we research Southern Black women's lives. Consider their positioning in contexts where we expect not to find them. Assume that they were present and involved, because they almost always were. Think expansively about where sources about their lives and activities are housed. Explicate the ways that we can and should understand and consume the diverse perspectives embedded in Southern women's history. Now, some of you might not believe the fat meat is greasy, but believe me when I tell you, this scholarship is long overdue, and there is much work to do to fill the gaps in the historiography to provide Southern Black women's history with increased visibility. Allot them their proper place in the historical narrative by generating studies that center their experiences so that, quote, the sisters can continue to get some history, and unceasingly transform Southern women's history generally by continuing to productively complicate the breadth and the depth of the field. Thank you. I apologize for getting nervous early on. I'm really nervous. I'm really scared.
It didn't show.
You should feel my hands like I could chill somebody's drink right now. I'm happy to entertain questions.
That's a good thing to admit in front of graduate students.
I still get extremely nervous. Yes.
You don't do a good job.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little more about your new book. And I'm actually specifically the one on the By Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps. And I'm particularly curious about your 1913 start date. I'm wondering what kicks that story off.
Actually, it's 1914, and what kicks that date off is the Smith-Lever Act in 1914, which is when the Cooperative Agricultural Extension Service is started, and I end in 1965, sort of, because that's when it's desegregated, right? Because, I mean, in just about every state in the Union has one, but in the South in particular, it is segregated, right? And it's an interesting story because Black women home demonstration agents, Black Extension Service agents are paid way less than their white counterparts. Like I have records that say a white home demonstration agent in, I don't know, Crittenden County might receive $1,200 a year. The Black home demonstration agent will be paid $300. Yeah. They also don't have access to the same kind of resources. I read a source somewhere, Jenny Moten, Robert R. Moten's wife, came to Arkansas, and she worked for the AAA during the 1930s. And one of the biggest complaints from Black home demonstration agents in Arkansas was that they won't let us come to the sessions. They won't let us access the resources. How do we serve our communities if we can't do this?
Cherisse, I was curious, since I did a lot of work with the Farm Security Administration photographic project, which started out in 1935, and there are a number of photographers that go to Arkansas. Were you able to find much at all about any of your because the photographers did photograph black women agricultural agents. Was there any resource material there for you, or is it so limited that it isn't? Could you use visual information as part of your resources?
Yes, actually, the University of Arkansas Press just published one. Yeah, so we do have one. Right. I mean, I literally just got it in the mail like 2 weeks ago. Right. So yes, I can do that. Yes.
They're all online. There are 200,000 images online at the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, and you can search by using place names.
Oh, okay.
The captions are all written by the photographers, so the information in the caption is the search-based.
Okay.
But there are 200,000 images on the Library of Congress's website.
I will be looking that up later.
So I found some limited interracial cooperation in World War I in North Carolina, agents. And following chronologically, I'm interested in if you see a change or how World War II impacts home demonstration agents and how they, how black home demonstration agents, extension agents use it politically. How do they do the double V thing?
Well, so let me back up a little bit. I really started looking at this because a colleague of mine in Arkansas wrote a book on the 100th anniversary of extension clubs. And I said, was there any political activism? She said, no, there wasn't any political activism. I didn't believe that. And so, and I'm not going to call names because she's been very helpful to me. But I started looking at the records, and what I saw was black home demonstration agents encouraging black women, rural black women, to pay their poll taxes. And teaching them about the candidates and talking about the candidates. That's political activism. It's right there, but she said it wasn't there. So I just took that as a challenge because I didn't believe that. I couldn't accept that. I haven't told her what I found yet, but we know what the truth is.
Question, so in one of the books that I'm reading from my college ends, they mentioned how, the author mentioned how Alpha Kappa Alpha went into Mississippi to, in the 1920s and 30s, I think, prior to Social Security, to provide like clinics and that type of services to rural Mississippians. I'm wondering if you're finding Alpha activism between the time period in your book in Arkansas, between 19.
All of them, all of the black sororities are involved in doing this. This is a community effort. So like, for example, many black people in the Arkansas Delta observe National Negro Health Week, right, which was started by Booker T. Washington. And so everybody in the community would get together for this. Black sororities and fraternities, fraternal organizations, white physicians, black and white public health nurses, all of these people would get together, usually at a black school or church, and they would do things during World War II, for example, like make sure people could take the Wasserman test to detect whether or not they had syphilis. So it wasn't just Alpha Kappa Alpha, it was all of them. And this was a big deal. In fact, one of the women I talk about in my book, her name was Anna M.B. Strong, and she was from Marianna, Arkansas in the Delta. I mean, not only is she active statewide, she was also on this national committee, and I forget the entire name of it, but basically it's the National Women's Committee for Social Prevention, because venereal disease is a big problem during World War II. So she's not only tackling this on the local level, she's on this national committee with all kinds of women, black, white, and otherwise, addressing this issue.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering if the lack of records about African American women is a nationwide issue or just like in the South? And also like the records that you have found, where have you found them going directly to the source, or have other like archives come up with things? How have you gathered that research?
Okay, I think a lot of it depends on where you are. So focusing specifically on Arkansas, there's just not that much in the archives. There's a lot in people's houses, right? Because Miss Annie, I mean, she has an entire room that she calls her library that just has documents and plaques and, I mean, she kept everything. She kept everything. For example, whenever she would go to a Farm Bureau meeting, she has, you know, the little tags she has from that. She has tags from home demonstrations. She kept everything. So this woman's house is the archives. And she just happens to really like me So I can access all of this stuff. And so that's how I've been able to access a lot of resources. The other thing that's been incredibly helpful are African American newspapers. I mean, I can spend hours, like I'll pay to use newspapers.com, but my university also has the African American newspapers database, the African American periodicals database. I also spend a lot of time looking at the historical newspapers database. And I also spend a lot of time looking through the records where I think they might not be. And that's how I sometimes find things. I just don't assume that, oh, they're talking about all these white folks, so there's nothing in there about black women. I've been wrong about that too many times. It may not be a lot, but there's something that usually connects me to something else that I already have. Yes.
Yeah, building off of the last question, I was hoping you could share your advice on working with kind of more traditional sources about African American women in the South that aren't necessarily reported by them. For example, for my own personal research, I looked at female juvenile justice in Florida, and the sources I'm working with are all social worker case files recorded by middle-class white women. So I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to get the most authentic experience of African American girls, if it's not necessarily in their own voice, but it's information reported about them.
Look at the National Association of Colored Women papers.
Okay.
They were overwhelmingly concerned about protecting young black women. One of their big initiatives, and this is true throughout the nation, was building industrial homes for young black girls. Because what would typically happen is if a young girl committed a crime, right, she'd be sent to prison, right, where all kinds of terrible things would happen, and nobody thought young black women were worth redeeming, right? And so one of their biggest campaigns, I know at least in Arkansas this was certainly true, was to get one of these establishments built for young black women. They had them for white women pretty early on. They had them for black men, white men. And in fact, in Arkansas, they had them in the teens. They don't have one for young black women until 1949. So it takes a while. But look at those records. I'm telling you, they talk about that a lot. And they're always, I mean, I have so many articles about black women, club women, black women in sororities who say, look, don't send this young woman to prison. Give her to us. We'll take care of her because we know what's going to happen if she gets put into the system. Yeah.
Cherisse, I know from your talk at the SAWH about Mrs. Pike, that you talked some about the importance of class.
Yes.
In enabling her to do her activism.
Right.
Would
Right.
you talk some about that?
Sure. What I didn't mention about Miss Annie is that she was a significant landowner, right? Like several thousand acres of land, and she inherited this land from her husband, who was one of the few African-American plantation owners in the Arkansas Delta, so much so that he had African-American sharecroppers working for him, right? And so when he died, he was about 30 or 40 years older than her. She was born in 1930, he was born in 1880, if that gives you any sense of the age difference. And so she inherited all of this land. And because he had the political clout and they had the land and they were independent and fairly wealthy landowners, it insulated them from a lot of, and that's not to say that there wasn't any foolishness. She still had to be very careful. She's a black woman in the South. But a lot of that insulated her from the worst of it. And even when I go down to Phillips County now, where she lives, in Marble, everybody's like, Miss Annie this, Miss Annie that. Miss Annie can have anything she wants. But I wonder if that was always the case, or if that's a more, recent development. But surely, throughout her life, that protected her from some of the serious foolishness.
I'm wondering how you incorporate the Great Migration in terms of black women's experiences.
How do I incorporate it?
How does it
factor into
the picture you're describing?
Really only as much, to say that relatives left the South, but most of these women did not leave the South. They didn't live anywhere but in the South. Miss Annie's, she's traveled all over the world, but she's never lived anywhere. And in fact, most of the women I write about have never lived anywhere other than in the South and in Arkansas in particular. All right, so the migration story might be a part of the family history, but it's not their personal experience because they made a conscious decision to remain in the South. Yes, ma'am.
I have a delicate question to ask about this issue of archives, because often we're talking to students and telling them about going out and doing this kind of work. And you pointed out how difficult it can be to do this kind of oral history. To, you know, and I was looking at a 19th century figure, Harriet Tubman, and found going to Maryland that it was a very delicate subject about who would be given access to material and information. So I'm really talking honestly about it and saying I had a lot of time, I had resources, so I felt as a senior scholar it was worth the investment it took in a way to insinuate myself into a community and be given the access I was given. But I'm questioning whether it's good advice to give to all students to do that. So can you comment on that? I mean, I would like to say, you find students who can talk their way into anything. Others who, might get lost getting out of the building. So you're trying to think about, ways of encouraging people and not giving them false hopes about issues.
I think context matters. I mean, I can speak to a couple of experiences, one that is not mine. But for me, it was for them, for these people in Marvel who invite me to all kinds of things and give me all kinds of information, they had to vet me. What I learned after the fact was that many, many questions have been asked about who I was, where I was from, and I found out later on that, yes, I said that, being in similar organizations made a difference, but also my last name made a difference. Everybody knows a branch, right? And they'll ask me, do you know so-and-so branch? I don't know these people. I'm married into the family, but it doesn't matter. Right? I'm connected, I'm married into the right family. So that gets me certain kinds of access. Now, things that I have told students of mine, particularly white students who might want to interview some of these people, there's some rules that you must know. Like, you can't call Miss Annie up and say, Annie, I want to come down and interview you. That's not going to happen. I mean, you need to approach her with the utmost respect, and if she wants to allow you to interview her, she will get in contact with you. I had to tell the student this, right? Because he's like, well, I'm just going to send these questions to so-and-so and she's going to answer all of them. That's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. I've also had to tell students, don't call these older black people by their first names. You don't know them like that. And even if they insist upon you doing that, you still say Miss So-and-so. There are rules. Right? There are rules. And you have to let them smell and feel you out. They have no reason to trust you. None at all. And some of these people have been visited by folks who have come and taken their history and wasted their time and then they disappear. All right? So these are things that I tell my students. I say, be very careful when you tread into these spaces because they have 101 reasons not to trust you and not to talk to you. They didn't even trust me. And it took a while. It took a few months before I could get access to Miss Annie. Now I talk to her once a week. But it took some time until they could feel me out and decide that I wasn't crazy and that she wouldn't have to shoot me. But that took some doing. So I think there's a very delicate balance there that some people just aren't aware of. Yes.
I would also say it may take a lot of time, but doing that kind of history, that kind of undiscovered history, is one of the best things that ever happened to me, and one of the reasons I became a historian. So my friends staged an intervention. I was 3 years into the dissertation trying to find Sarah Dudley Petty, and they literally took me out and said, you can't write your dissertation like this. You can't spend 3 years on this. And so in one last round of phone calls, I called every black church in here. Got nothing. Finally, one of the ministers said he didn't know. And I said, well, my name is Glenda Gilmore. He said, are you related to Tom.
Right.
And said,
Right.
yes.
Right.
And he said, Eileen Petty's number is 24379.
Right. That's exactly right. And the other, yeah, and the other thing that made a difference as well is connection to institutions, right? Because Miss Annie's son had graduated from the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, which is a historically black school. They had given a lot of money to the institution, and many members of my husband's family had graduated from the institution. I didn't know any of this stuff would become relevant one day, but it made a difference. It made a difference. And even when I got to her house, it wasn't like, okay, I'm here, let's get this interview on so I can get on back to Jonesboro. No. You got to spend some time building that relationship, which in some people's case means that you have to sit there and have a meal with them, and an extensive meal. And when they are ready, that's when the interview begins. You don't go in there and push.
Cherisse, I'd like to say that the same principles apply to trying to interview old white segregationists, because they understand now that their point of view is anathema to yours, you know. Right. And,
that's a good point.
They've been abused for a long time, so it takes time, and it takes being respectful and totally non-judgmental. Right. And again, in Miss Annie's case, the other thing that I'm not going to write about, so this doesn't leave this room, when she was on the campaign trail, people tried to kill her. And all these years later, she still tells that story as if these people are still trying to kill her. Right? So she doesn't know me. Why would she just let me in her house? Right? Well, thank you.